My name is Patrick Carter. I'm a lawyer. I work at the law firm of Nossaman, LLP. We represent public agencies on infrastructure projects across the country. And I'm very pleased to have an excellent panel here today to talk about one of the most important things that we can talk about in infrastructure, and that is planning towards a future of zero-emission vehicles. So with me today, I have from LA Metro, Akiko Yamagami. She is the Manager of Transportation Planning, Goods Movement, County-wide Planning and Development. I also have here Danielle Wiseman from San Diego Gas and Electric. She is the Business Development Manager for Clean Transportation. Jason Rondeau from LA Department of Water and Power, Director of Resource Planning, Development and Programs. Again, LA DWP, Department of Water and Power. And then we have finally Alicia Guild, U.S. Department of Energy, National Manager for Zero Emission Vehicle Partnerships and Engagement, Technology Integration Program, Vehicle Technology Office. That's the federal agency. They have long names. All right, so with that, I think we're just going to jump right in. We don't have a ton of time. We have a topic that we could spend an entire week talking about. It's very complex. It has many tentacles throughout, but let's just get started. So first of all, the state of California is on the leading edge of our nation's move towards a world where zero-emission vehicles are going to predominate. And the question is, what do you make of the federal government's and the state government's investments towards funding the necessary EV charging infrastructure? And is it enough? Is it properly focused? Let's start with Alicia.
Great, thank you so much, and happy to be here. Great to see all of you. What a great turnout, and delighted to be a part of this panel. So California certainly is on the leading edge of advancing zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure. In my prior role, I managed, working with my team, and I actually have two colleagues here from CalSTART who manage the state incentive programs for charging infrastructure for light-duty vehicles, but also the charging and hydrogen fueling incentive program for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. So there's a lot of investments coming from the state of California investing in infrastructure development. I'm talking hundreds and millions of dollars that California as a state is already putting into building out the infrastructure and ecosystem for that zero-emission transportation future that we want to see. The federal government, you all may have heard about the $7.5 billion that's available through the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, as well as the discretionary grant program, focused on building out charging infrastructure along transportation corridors, but also making sure that there is a priority to leaving no one behind. So putting 40% of those federal investments to support and benefit our low-income and our disadvantaged communities. In terms of where we need to go and the amount of investments that's needed to really electrify the state of California and beyond, do we have enough investments? I think we have enough, certainly, I don't want to say enough, but we have a lot of funding that's really stimulating the economy, stimulating the marketplace. In terms of our ability to meet the timeline, to meet that demand, it's going to take partnerships, it's going to take collaboration. Certainly, even just at this panel that we have here, whether it's a utility, whether it's a planning agency, we all need to be looking at how we can be a part of that future, how we can collaborate to make this transition. Utilities also have investments to support building out that infrastructure, and maybe even we can have someone talk about that. I don't know if you want to talk.
Danielle, on behalf of investor-owned utilities, what's your perspective on the federal investments, the state investments that are planned for this important infrastructure?
I'm really happy to see NEVI come through. I think taking a programmatic approach to how we implement electric vehicle charging infrastructure, I think, is key to helping to facilitate the market, helping customers overcome some of the behaviors to adoption, which are largely driven by, I don't have charging stations where it's convenient, whether it's at my home or at the place where I work or where I spend my time. And so when we see funding opportunities to help facilitate private industry, but also take advantage from an institution level, from the federal government collaborating with state agencies who then collaborate with local governments and with utilities. I think creating that partnership and those channels of communication, I think, is key. So I'm very happy to see the direction it's going. It's unfortunate to me that it's this far along, because as somebody said earlier, the next few years are going to be really critical in the energy transition. We've got some really aggressive goals and a lot of pressures on our bulk power system, even just to decarbonize our resources, the generating facilities to serve those vehicles. And so how do we spend those dollars wisely, fast? And we're not throwing spaghetti at the wall with so many really incredible things that the technology can do, but really be really targeted to invest those dollars where they're going to have maximum impact for our constituents. And I think focusing on at least those transportation arteries, I think, is really central to helping to catapult the industry, and that will pay dividends. As you see more adoption, there will be more infill of electric vehicle charging infrastructure.
And Jason, about that collaboration, there are so many stakeholders who want to have input into the who, what, where, when, how of EV charging infrastructure. How do we ensure that we coordinate those efforts, that we make sure that we're developing an ecosystem that's accessible, that's efficient, that's reliable, that's resilient? How do we do that?
It's a very big question. I will start by saying, at LAWP, we're a vertically integrated, publicly owned utility. So we are in a very good position, I think, to understand what our role is with respect to electric vehicle charging and just electrification in general. The way that we sort of handle this at an implementation level, and I'll talk about it from like an implementation side as well as a medium and long-term planning side. But on the implementation side, we have, what I think many utilities or many implementers would have, which is coordination meetings with industry, with stakeholders, with advocacy entities, to identify what we can do to do things better, what we can do to make things more affordable and more simple. I think we may touch on this a little bit later, but the reality is that we're juggling many different competing priorities, and obviously electric vehicles ought to be one of our top priorities, at a societal level. So that's on the implementation side. On the planning side, what we've done over the last several years, and I think this dates back to over a decade or so, is we have an advisory group of leaders and organizations in the city of Los Angeles that actually sit with our power planners every year to figure out how best to plan our power system future. That includes electric vehicles, that includes our distribution system, all the upgrades that Danielle mentioned that we have to do to support electric vehicles, as well as all of the resources. So how quickly we decarbonize and what way we decarbonize and what the strategy is. And what that allows us to do is it allows our planners at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power to understand what the priorities, what the perspectives are of our stakeholders. And it allows the stakeholders to understand that power planning is extraordinarily complex. Now, we've taken that, and we view ourselves from the perspective of transparency and stakeholder engagement, we view ourselves as leaders in that area, but we actually took that a step further. We did a study with the National Renewable Energy Lab several years back, which showed us different pathways to get to a renewable future, but one of the takeaways was, unless we have intentionally designed policies and programs, the future will not be equitable. We will take inequities in the city of Los Angeles that have persisted over the last several decades, and we will make them worse unless we engage the community, unless we do targeted deployment of our programs, and that includes electric vehicles. So we launched what is called the Equity Strategies effort a year and a half ago, where we brought in community-based organizations, and we allowed them to set the priority of what areas we want to look into in terms of program design, the way we engage the public, and so on. And so for a long-term planning perspective, that is one of the most important areas for us to make sure that we are deploying electric vehicle chargers, deploying dollars for rebates in the areas that need them, not just the areas that can afford them.
And Alicia, what about that? I mean, we have this discussion always about make sure that all the stakeholders are coordinated. One of the first questions is, who are the stakeholders? Do you have a view on kind of who the stakeholders are and how to coordinate them?
Sure, no, and I really appreciate what you were just saying in terms of all the collaboration that you're doing and engagement to really help support this transition. So at the Department of Energy, and in my role in particular, it's a newer role, but it's really important because the Department of Energy is working very closely with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation to roll out all these investments for charging infrastructure. And what's absolutely critical is who is missing at that table, like who needs to be a part of the conversation in order to make this transition successfully. And so just as an example, yesterday I was at the International Car Rental Show, meeting with the rental car industry to understand what are the challenges and barriers that they're enduring as they're integrating electric vehicles in their fleet. And their biggest challenge is infrastructure and how they're working with airports who may have different planning timelines for building out infrastructure or even bringing more power to the airport to support the charging of maybe shuttle buses or ground service equipment. How can rental car companies who really want to go in that direction, how can we set them up for success? In terms of the stakeholders, and what I like to call them partners. Like I really like for us all to be in the collaborative spirit. We're in this together. We can do this. So it's working with utilities. It's working with government. It's working with local government, municipal government. It's working with community groups, environmental justice groups. It's working with industry of all kinds. It's working with various planning agencies, environmental nonprofit organizations, industry associations. I mean, there's so many different partners that need to be at the table to really support and understand the different perspectives in order to build consensus, in order to create that plan and that pathway to make it happen. Because we may not realize that there is a barrier that's holding one stakeholder or one partner back, and by bringing them to the conversation, we can understand what their needs are. And I think with the Department of Energy, what we're really hoping to do is understand what are all those bottlenecks, what are all those challenges, so that we can be more thoughtful as we're developing funding programs or if we're helping to influence policy, that we're doing it through meaningful engagement, through meaningful collaboration, that we're understanding what is it going to take to set everyone up for success to meet that zero-emission transportation future that we all want to see.
And on the topic of the private sector and enterprise, there is a role for the private sector, specifically in the area of investment, private sector investment. Danielle, what's your take on the potential for public-private partnerships to facilitate investing in charging infrastructure?
Yeah, I think the private sector plays front and center role, and I think we can all sort of share the challenge, whether you're a municipal government or you're a utility. The challenge is we don't control private industry, but we can enable and facilitate it through permit streamlining, through providing technical advisory services. That's the role we play, and then we have to hope that we get it right. And sort of to Alicia's point, that means really making sure we're engaging diverse perspectives and hearing what their challenges are when we make planning. But I think the role for public-private partnerships, I'll give the city of San Diego as an example because that's where I am. But I think it's a very good example of some of this programmatic approach. Like NEVI is very programmatic from the top down, how we're going to plan transportation corridors. But even looking at a public-private partnership where you're facilitating charging stations on all publicly owned land and using it in partnership with private industry, an EV service provider, so that at least there's less stakeholders at the table, less variation. You can sort of delineate what the terms and conditions are and have a very thoughtful, methodical, planned approach to how you eliminate some of those barriers at the local level. So I think looking for more opportunities for those partnerships and understanding some of the financial constraints We all face resource and financial constraints, and I think that at least looking for ways, whether it's through funding sources or through process improvements or through just information sharing, I think there's so much opportunity for different stakeholders to come to the table. The investor-owned utilities role is changing over time, especially in the electrification space. And so, having us at the table to even provide technical advisory services or help you understand programs, I think is also key. So it's not necessarily a public-private partnership, but I think it's a robust understanding of the different stakeholders that need to be included in the conversation.
I will just add that, so private industry is absolutely critical. One of the examples of which government is looking at how to foster more public-private partnerships and realizing how critical collaboration with the industry is, because whether you're the technology provider, you're the vehicle manufacturer, whether you're the user or the fleet operator, really understanding their needs to be successful at deploying electric vehicles or electric trucks, electric buses, is absolutely critical. And where they see a need for where infrastructure has to go to set them up for success, how they are a part of informing and helping to prioritize where infrastructure it needs to go is absolutely critical. The Department of Energy just recently announced over $7 million to help 7 corridor planning partnerships to evaluate infrastructure needs for medium and heavy duty trucks that are carrying freight along freight corridors. This will be a really innovative partnership, and what it required is that not only was it engaging with industry, working with truck stops, working with fueling providers, working with truck fleets, truck OEMs, industry associations, but also making sure that communities were a part of the conversation, as they are often overburdened with the transportation emissions that they're impacted by if they're living nearby a corridor. So how we're bringing in communities to be a part of that conversation, and for industry to also hear from communities where those needs are, so that they can be prioritizing the deployment of zero-emission vehicles along transportation corridors that are going to help the air quality, that are going to help improve the livelihoods of people that are living where there's a lot of freight activity and goods movement.
So let's talk about communities. Akiko, you had something to add.
Right. Well, perhaps before we transition to communities, I wanted to add on the public-private partnership from goods movement perspective. I've been working on I-710 zero-emission truck corridor program. For the longest time, we were struggling to, well, first of all, we recognize that infrastructure is, charging and refueling infrastructure is lagging behind zero-emission vehicles. The vehicles are coming. They're already here, and we are expecting a big surge of zero-emission trucks to be coming online. But we've also heard this from the trucking industry as well as our partners, that the infrastructure is lagging to support those zero-emission vehicles. So the question for us was, okay, then what are we going to do to, like, where are we going to build the infrastructure? Then we struggled for the longest time to find the suitable land available to install heavy-duty truck charging or refueling. We actually consulted with our partners, including Caltrans, and we just had a hard time finding publicly accessible land. But then last year, Mobile Source Air Pollution Reduction Committee, also known as MSRC, issued an RFI to find, to solicit information from both public and private entities who are interested in developing their land for publicly accessible charging and refueling. We were pleasantly shocked by number of responses that we received from private entities who come with their own land, and they're proposing to develop their land for publicly accessible heavy-duty vehicle charging that we could not find. So after we saw all the responses, I want to say the light bulb just went up, like, it lit up and said, like, this is probably the most promising way forward for not just public agencies, but as a society to support zero-emission heavy-duty trucks, whether it's for battery electric or hydrogen refueling. We need to partner with private entities and figure out ways to actually expedite the deployment of infrastructure in order to support all those vehicles that are coming online.
So let's talk for a moment about the community, because this is a very complex component of solving the issue of public infrastructure for EV charging, is making sure that the community's views, needs, interests are considered. And in particular, disadvantaged communities, and trying to figure out how to solve this very complex problem. And as planning agencies, regional planning agencies, transportation planning has to consider the interests of all those who are affected by a project. The question is, how do we create incentives to ensure that the needs of disadvantaged communities, underserved communities, are considered as we migrate to a future of EV and related charging infrastructure? So why don't we start with Jason on this?
Thanks. I mentioned our equity strategies effort from a long-term planning perspective, so I'll talk more immediate in terms of how we address the challenge of making sure that we get charging infrastructure and dollars for rebates into underserved parts of Los Angeles. And I think most of you are familiar with the Los Angeles, the diversity of Los Angeles, the economic diversity of Los Angeles. About 50% of Los Angeles is considered a disadvantaged community by California CalEnviroscreen. We also know that the majority of folks in Los Angeles are renters, which presents another challenge for EV infrastructure. So what we've done so far is we've set up rebates for used EVs that have an increased level of rebates for customers in disadvantaged communities. We've also done the same thing for EV chargers as well. We've also gotten really creative with some of our other distributed resource programs, where we just recently took to our board of commissioners a proposal for, and we received approval from our board on this. We have a proposal, a program that is going to be piloted, where developers who put parking canopy solar and also install EV charging in disadvantaged communities that is publicly available will receive an additional incentive on top of that as well. So it allows us to deploy resources for renewable energy, but also try to deploy some of the electric vehicle charging as well. The one thing that I'll mention as well that we have yet to fully address, and that I think we do need to address, is when we look at what it's going to take to see a renewable and a carbon-free future, which includes electrification, we're going to have to spend over $50 billion and possibly upwards of $80 billion over the next 20 years. And the way the lion's share of that will be funded through rates. And so when we talk about the equitable deployment of programs and infrastructure, we also need to look at, is our rate structure equitable as well? And the way that rates are structured today is, when you consider the fact that we need to raise $50 to $80 billion of new money through rates, that is a very regressive way to fund infrastructure transformation. So from all of those perspectives, we're trying to get a lot more intentional about how we do it, but the one area that we have not fully addressed is the rates perspective.
And from the federal government's perspective, the federal government has put a big emphasis on social equity in transportation planning and spending the money that's available. How does the federal government look at making sure distribution between urban, suburban, rural, Indian reservation, Native American reservations, how do we make sure that that's equitably distributed?
I would say that's probably, in terms of my focus area, my favorite part, in terms of what we're doing with the Department of Energy. The Biden administration created a program called Justice 40, with the whole intent that 40% of the investments, federal investments, go toward disadvantaged, low-income, and tribal communities. We're in the process, and we're working very closely through, collaboration with other federal agencies and even closely with state agencies on how we can better engage with communities and to bring the charging infrastructure to where they are. And being really thoughtful as you're talking about how we're creating incentives, how are we going to make the incentives work for communities? And a lot of it comes down to where they live. Are they living in a multifamily apartment building? Is there charging infrastructure there? Is the landlord willing to put infrastructure there? There's so many challenges around where we can bring charging infrastructure to really help communities deploy zero-emission vehicles. So what are the incentives that are available? So with the discretionary grant program as an example, $2.5 billion that's available under that program, 1.25 is specifically focused on low-income, disadvantaged, and tribal communities. And that's going to be tailored to, okay, where are we putting the charging infrastructure, but at the same time, not operating in a silo? How are we also making vehicles more affordable for them to be able to purchase an electric vehicle? Well, that's where the clean car tax incentive comes in, where there's actually incentives now to support the purchase of used electric vehicles. But bringing that whole picture together for communities is absolutely critical. So understanding how to reach them, what information do they have? How do we provide more technical assistance? What language does it need to be in? How are we developing materials and our engagement that's culturally appropriate depending on the community and what the community's needs are? So really tailoring our approach depending on the community that you're going into and making sure that we're collaborating with public, private, and community partners to be able to reach them effectively and to help them develop that pathway to success of deploying zero-emission vehicles within their own community. So we're, through the Joint Office, developing a lot of technical assistance programs on how we're reaching communities. I'm now responsible for overseeing all of our engagement through the Vehicle Technologies Office with tribal affairs, and so working with tribes throughout the U.S. to help understand not only their zero-emission vehicle needs, but their energy needs. Sometimes it's an absolute lack of power that they have coming into their community. So how are we bringing additional power to tribal communities and also supporting renewable energy? So looking at how we might be able to bring solar or wind to their communities, before even looking at how they're transitioning their transportation system to zero emission, it's looking at all aspects, that ecosystem in which they live in. So really, as you're going into communities, understanding what their needs are and tailoring programs to meet them where they are. And to understand that they might have other priorities, and you need to think about those priorities and where you can help fit in to make it successful for them.
And as we talk about communities, one of the areas that jumps to mind for me is the port complex here, the Los Angeles, Long Beach Port Complex, the severe problem we have with air quality in the port complex, the high incidence of asthma and other conditions for young people who live in these areas. And so one of the biggest impacts that zero-emission vehicles can have on our region in particular would be in the area of clean trucks, buses, other commercial vehicles. And so Akiko, what are agencies doing to address this critical need of zero-emission vehicles for trucks?
Well, thank you for that question, so I can showcase what LA Metro is doing. But I would like to perhaps start by saying the LA Metro Board authorized to spend at least $50 million as a seed funding to accelerate the deployment of 710 corridor zero emission truck program. And that is intended to address all those negative impacts that the list of negative impacts that you mentioned. But at the same time, what the board directed staff to do is really figure out the mechanisms to build in ways to realize the benefits that the communities desire. And that includes not only just clean air and improved public health, but two things that I hear repeatedly in our conversation with community members near the ports as well as within the 710 corridor is the workforce investment, so that community members in those within the corridors will have a sustainable and sound upward mobility, or the pathway for upward mobility. And the other one is support for the small businesses, and by that I mean many of the drayage trucks or the drayage companies are small businesses, and by subjecting them to transition to very expensive zero-emission trucks, we are, without any support system, we are threatening them to go out of business. So those small business owners are also the residents within those corridors. So we have to figure out ways to support the small businesses to remain in business, in drayage business in particular, so that we will continue to facilitate the goods movement system that supports the ports, this region, and also the national economy.
Yeah, the issue of truckers is a hugely complex issue involving many issues. Of course, the cost, small businesses that are affected by this, also the range of vehicles and other things. I wonder, Danielle, if you have a view on kind of how we might address trucking as a particular component of the charging infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's the million-dollar question right now, especially knowing that the California Air Resources Board is set to vote in the next couple of weeks on the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, and I think understanding that this is going to have a severe impact. I think Akiko hit the nail on the head with respect to how this could, at the same time that these regulations will help not include equity components, they could create inequities if we don't do it right. And I think that's where the partnership is key. When I look at NEVI, I think that is a mechanism to improve the accessibility, at least of the charging infrastructure, for not just the trucking within our state, but as well as light duty vehicles. But I think one of the key challenges around that is funding. These industries require a lot of funding, so for us to decarbonize medium duty, heavy duty within the state, there's not just barriers from the infrastructure side, but also just for them to adopt those vehicles. And for SDG&E, we're in the process of putting together a proposal for at least a technical advisory services, hoping to fill that gap for specifically the medium duty, heavy duty sector that requires so much understanding. Guidance is what are the funding sources that are out there? What are the grants that are available? How should I right size the infrastructure to serve my needs, as opposed to maybe they get swayed to build out more infrastructure or more equipment than they really need, because they are also getting bombarded by a lot of vendors selling products and services. So I think it's a huge challenge, but it requires sort of a lot of partnership among the agencies and being very deliberate. We're looking at our system planning, our electric system planning, especially at the border now, understanding this is the largest port of entry, land entry within the United States, and understanding how these trucking associations industry is going to be impacted by the new regulations, and how can we better plan the electric system to meet those needs? Not just what do our substations and our distribution and transmission circuits need, but also where are there opportunities for siting electric vehicle infrastructure so that we can better plan. And that really, I hate throwing out these overused words, but it really requires collaboration. It really requires, if I can ask anything of this meeting, understanding there's so many municipal agencies here, it's that engagement with your utility as early as possible in the process. When you see applications come through for development, direct them to talk to the utility to get some of that advice as early as possible. They may not realize how those timelines can impact their bottom line in meeting their business objectives.
Can I just quickly add? So in the state of California, in terms of investments that are available for small fleets, for truck fleets that are looking at this advanced clean fleet rule, the California Air Resources Board has a program called the Hybrid Zero-Emission in Truck and Bus Voucher Incentive Program that's managed by CalSTART. There's also a up to $500 million incentive program through the California Energy Commission that's funding infrastructure for medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles, including electric charging and hydrogen fueling, called the Energized Commercial Vehicles Project. Both programs tailored at looking at how to provide incentives for the truck market and the bus market. We realize the state of California, I'm speaking like I'm still working on those programs, but there's so much investment that's available to support truck fleets to help make this transition. Around the drayage issue of supporting all of the work that the ports of LA and Long Beach are doing, working with LA Metro, working with Caltrans, working with the California Energy Commission, the California Air Resources Board, CalSTART, nonprofit organizations also managing what they're calling the Zero Emission Drayage Working Group. And it's this opportunity of collaboration where it's bringing utilities together, it's bringing truck fleets together, the agencies, the community organizations that are in the communities that live near these transportation corridors, that are also, in many cases, independent owner-operators that are living within those communities, that are operating the trucks that are moving goods from the ports to the Inland Empire. To be a part of this collaborative effort of looking at how to make that transition feasible for all vehicle fleets, even your small mom and pop independent owner operators that have maybe one truck or maybe 3 trucks within their fleet that they're, depending on putting bread and butter on their table. This is their livelihood. How are we making that transition more feasible for them? So there is a lot of good collaborative efforts right now focusing on that through a public, private, and community approach, which I think is absolutely critical.
Okay, so we're going to try to get 2 more topics in 2 minutes and 16 seconds. So
You're funny.
And this is directed to the utility representatives we have here. You don't have unlimited resources. You don't have unlimited cash. How do you prioritize among the various competing demands for funding and resources, including things associated, demands associated with our housing crisis here in California? How do you kind of square the circle?
Okay, I'll start. And we're now down to 1 minute and 30 seconds. So, there's not much to say on this without going into a ton of detail, except to just highlight the fact that we have a housing crisis in many parts of the state, including Los Angeles. And that is one of our top priorities, to make sure that we're doing line extensions, to make sure that we're interconnecting customers, to make sure that new housing can get built so that folks can get into new housing. A lot of that needs to get done expeditiously so that funding can get secured for those. But at the same time, we still have to understand that the key to our renewable and our carbon-free future is really electric vehicles. And it's electric vehicles because we cannot do this carbon-free transition without expanding the amount of sales that we have. It won't be affordable unless we see an electrified transportation fleet and building electrification as well. So we can't completely deprioritize that, but we do have to recognize what's in front of us immediately is the housing crisis. But again, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So.
Yeah, but we don't want to fall. The only thing I would add is that, we're really looking at how to be lean and be very careful, having a fiduciary obligation to our ratepayers and understanding all of the pressures on rates from gas to the kilowatt hour. And I think what we're doing and how we're prioritizing is looking at how we can facilitate the market in ways that are going to have maximum impact. So really targeting key areas like medium duty, heavy duty, focusing on electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and being very focused in what we're doing. But a lot of it involves looking at ways to think differently and enable conversations, enable information sharing. And it's a huge transition right now. Just our business models are sort of upended with the fact that there's so many parties, there's so many stakeholders now. It's not just customer service, utility to customer, but there's EV service providers, there's solar vendors, there's housing developers. And so when we provide electric service, it really is, it cannot be discriminatory. So we're looking at ways to be equitable to everybody who's coming in and requesting service, whether it's somebody building a home to somebody building a charging station, looking at ways to do that, but focusing on enabling infrastructure. What are sort of the no regrets investments we can make that are going to have maximum impact for everybody?
Okay, well, it looks like we ran out of time, but I'm hoping that we can get one final insight from Akiko on the issue of clean trucks and what LA Metro is doing on clean trucks.
The last insight, I want to say we have been working fast and furious trying to deploy the 710 zero-emission truck program. But as I mentioned, with the result of the MSRC's RFI last year, we're starting to see a breakthrough moment. I do think the next couple of years is going to be a really exciting time for not only LA Metro, but LA County as a whole, where we will start seeing the actual deployment of ZE truck infrastructure being built. So maybe we'll catch up in a year or two and see where we are.
All right. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you.